Early on in the book of Joshua in the Bible, there's a story about how God made dry land in the middle of the Jordan River so that his people, the Israelites, could cross and get to the other side. Once they do that, he has some of the Israelite men gather some stones from the riverbed where they just crossed over and bring it to a place called Gilgal. And he has them set it up in this big pile. And you might ask, well, why does God have them do that? And God says, I want you to set this up as a memorial. I want you to remember what I did for you. That when your children ask, or your children's children ask as they walk past that big pile of rocks and say, well, why is this here? You can tell them, you can help them to remember. Remember what I accomplished for you. You know, this idea of remembering, it's a theme, it's a thread you see throughout the biblical storyline. How important it is for us to be a people who are intentionally remembering, that we have rituals that we should regularly participate in to help us intentionally remember what's happened in the past. So think of Passover. That's one of the central rituals for the Jewish people. Passover is intentionally done every year to help the Jewish people remember the time when they were slaves in Egypt and what God did to help rescue them out of that slavery. Think of communion. In the Christian tradition, communion is done where we take of bread and we take of a cup, and we're told to do this in remembrance of Jesus, in remembrance of his death. And now saying that, I think one of the things you realize, as Christians, we remember that remembering isn't always comfortable or easy, because what we're remembering about the death of Jesus is that he died for our sins. So that directly hits us, remembering the fact that Jesus died for our sake. But that remembering is necessary and essential. We are to regularly take communion, to regularly remember the fact that Jesus died for us, because it helps us be the kind of people we want to be today. But remembering the fact that Jesus died for us, it helps us today to be a humble people, to be a thankful people, to be people who want to continue to be humble and thankful. It sets a course for the kind of people we want to be in the future, that we want to be people who are also selfless and self-giving like Jesus was for us. You know, there's also multiple examples in the Bible of what happens when people stop being a remembering people. And so we see multiple times in the Bible where the Israelites aren't intentionally remembering. They fall away from these rituals to help them remember their history. And what's the result? They end up repeating some of the worst things in their past. They begin following idols. They begin engaging in practices that take them away from God. They become their worst version of themselves. So right now in our country, we are in the midst of a racially charged moment. I think we all know this. And it's a moment that I hope would bring a lot of positive change. There's a lot of things that I'm hoping will change in this particular racially charged moment. But here's one change I'd like to present, and it's this, that we as Americans would more and more now be a people who are willing to remember. Specifically, that we're a people that are willing to remember when it comes to our history, when it comes to race. That we no longer look back at our racial history and say, well, it's really difficult and divisive, we can't talk about it. But no, that we follow, I think, the biblical example, the biblical theme that remembering is important for our people. That we are willing to look at our past, not just the good parts, but the bad parts as well. Particularly, though, our history when it comes to race. That we would be willing to be a people who remember, and that we're intentional about it. So here's one small way you can do that, like right now, like next week. Next week is Juneteenth. And if you're watching this and you're like, what's Juneteenth? Well, you should know what Juneteenth is. Juneteenth, and we'll put something in the caption below you can read a little bit more about Juneteenth. But in short, Juneteenth is a yearly commemoration on June 19th to mark the end of slavery in America. And so here's something, a small thing that you can begin to do, a small thing that has major payoff if a lot of us do it. Maybe you, from now on, commit as an individual, as a family group, or maybe as part of the community that you're part of, you commit every Juneteenth to intentionally remember and reflect on the historical Black experience in America. And so let me give you some ways in which I think you can be intentional about doing that every Juneteenth. You could, first of all, begin by remembering and reflecting on the suffering that happens to so many Black people in this country, in our history, for most of our nation's history. To remember to reflect on that suffering, to remember and reflect on the failures to treat Black people as human beings for so much of our history, to lament that we have spent hundreds of years treating Black people the way we have in our country. So remember, reflect, lament on that part of the Black experience. A second thing to do would be to remember by hearing the voices of Black people, that you make every Juneteenth an opportunity, at least every Juneteenth, it'd be great to do it more than that, but at least every Juneteenth, that you will intentionally look to hear from the voices of Black people in the past. So you take time to read about the narratives of slaves and what they went through. You maybe read some good historical books. You hear some voices from people during some of those time periods of the books that you read from. You maybe read about Richard Allen, who started the first Black denomination because the white church he wanted to join would not let him join. Read the autobiography of Frederick Douglass. Read some of the books of Taylor Branch, particularly, he has a huge 3-volume set, but you can read a 1-volume sort of summary of all 3 volumes called The King Years, about the Civil Rights Movement. So remember by hearing the voices of Black people in the past. Third, remember by celebrating the victories of the past. There's a lot of darkness, but there were some bright spots in which we finally, as a nation, at different points, rose up and took some big steps forward to address the injustices that were committed in so many different areas when it comes to different ethnic groups in our country, but particularly when it comes to Black people. So remember by celebrating the Emancipation Proclamation. We celebrate the end of segregation, the efforts to end segregation. We celebrate the Civil Rights Movement and the passing of various acts. Remember by celebrating just the Black experience in general and all the things that Black people, even with all the suffering, brought to this country in all sorts of areas, in every area: music, art, sports, theology, philosophy, all sorts of different areas. Celebrate that. Thank God that those things still happened. As I said, remembering is not easy. It's not comfortable. That's why I think so many of us don't do it. We only want to remember the good things. But remembering our past, all of it, is essential. It's necessary. That God uses a people who are willing to intentionally remember to shape them to be the kind of people that they need to be today. A people who look back and I'm not asking you to look back in the past with anger and bitterness, but with humility, with sorrow, and with a desire to learn. Because by looking back in that way, that allows us to be the people that we want to be today, and allows us to be bold towards being the people that we are still working to be. So let me be the first to say, Happy Juneteenth. Let's remember together.